Balance of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew. Kaylee Lines has the night off. We begin with a major cabinet shakeup at the White House. The president announcing Kristi Noem is out as Secretary of Homeland Security, nominating Oklahoma Senator Markwayne Mullin to replace her, effective March 31st. Here was Mullin's immediate reaction when the news was released.
I want people to understand, when I go into this position, yes, I'm a Republican, yes, I'm conservative, but Department of Homeland Security is to keep everybody, regardless if you support me, if you don't support me, regardless of what your thoughts are. I'm here to enforce the policies that Congress passed, and right now I'm part of it, but once I make that transition, my focus is to keep the homeland secure.
In the backdrop of all of this, the ongoing funding fight over DHS, which of course remains shut down. We have team coverage with Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan live from the White House and Bloomberg's Myles Miller live on Capitol Hill. Myles, we'll start with you. Noem has been under heavy scrutiny for some time. What was the breaking point on this?
The breaking point appears to be that $220 million contract for that advertisement. She was questioned here on Capitol Hill yesterday and the day before about that contract, and specifically if the president had given her the okay to do that advertisement and to disperse those funds. She said yes, and the president told people privately he had no idea about that ad campaign. She presented herself as a fiscal hawk. She said to people privately that she had gone over about 9,000 to 10,000 contracts and looking at contracts at DHS and how she could miss this contract, or how she could say she didn't know anything about how it was petered out, is what really led to her demise. It was that, but also the shootings of two unarmed protesters in Minneapolis. In addition to that, it was also some funding fights, right? You had Tom Tillis here on Capitol Hill saying that enough wasn't done in North Carolina as it related to FEMA, and she had simply fallen out of favor with the president. Here's where we are right now. Markwayne Mullin going to assume this seat on the 31st of this month, saying he hopes to have bipartisan support, and saying that he is going to work across the aisle to try to get things done with DHS. But we are in an updated posture right now with the war in Iran. DHS is going to have to figure out how they're going to respond to terror threats, and a lot of that focus has been taken off because of some of these issues with fiscal management, the issues with controversy at DHS, and all of that. The president hopeful with putting Markwayne Mullin in that changes.
Bloomberg's Myles Miller live on Capitol Hill, where, of course, the confirmation process will proceed. Myles, thank you. Let's go to the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, where we find the president and Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan live from the North Lawn at the White House. Kate, reports suggested the president had been reaching out to Republicans on Capitol Hill to find out if they, in fact, wanted to see Noem go and who she might be replaced by. What was it that brought him to this point?
That's right. So after months of controversy, because we have been talking about Noem's job potentially being in peril for months now, Kristi Noem has become the first cabinet secretary to get ousted in Trump's second term. There has been an effort by Susie Wiles and other leadership in the White House to really have less turnover in this term by the president. So it is notable that she is the first cabinet secretary to go. Noem is going to be taking on a new role as one that did not exist before today, as the special envoy for the Shield of Americas, which is apparently a new security initiative. So this firing comes as Noem faced a lot of questions about misconduct allegations on Capitol Hill this week. There's a lot to unpack when it comes to Noem's tumultuous tenure at DHS, but one in particular that reportedly really rankled the president, was really a source of frustration, was this more than $200 million ad buy. The decision to place the ad buy, Noem did star very prominently in this ad, and she also told lawmakers that Trump had signed off on this. Trump is now saying publicly that he did not. So Noem will continue to serve until March 31st, but then there will be new leadership at DHS. And of course, Senator Markwayne Mullin needs to be confirmed by the Senate before assuming that role permanently.
Kate, I want to ask you quickly about gas prices. This is something that's dogging the president right now, and it plays into, of course, what's happening in Iran. $3.25, the national average, according to AAA. How much of an issue is it for this White House?
Rising gas prices could potentially be a massive issue and political headache for not just the White House, Republicans in Congress. This is something that the White House is very aware of, as are other Republicans. We heard the president speak just a few moments ago about Iran and oil prices. He said that there was further action that was going to be imminent to reduce pressure on oil. He also told Reuters today, he was asked by Reuters whether he was concerned about rising gas prices, and he said, if they rise, they rise. He said that they would drop very rapidly once this is over. But of course, it is very unclear at the moment when Operation Epic Fury, when the U.S. military action in Iran will be over, and when these gas prices will drop.
Kate, thank you so much. This is a big day at the White House. Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan live on the North Lawn. Joining us now with his reaction to all of this. Live from Capitol Hill, Democratic Senator Gary Peters of Michigan, who is ranking member, the top Democrat on the Senate Homeland Security Committee, responsible confirming the next head of DHS. He also serves on Armed Services. And Senator, it's great to have you back on Bloomberg TV and radio. What do you make of this pick by President Trump? Would you support your colleague from Oklahoma?
Well, he's going to have to go through the confirmation process. Obviously, this is all happening pretty quick, but we'll want to evaluate his experience, his background, and kind of his vision on how to fix what's really wrong at Homeland Security. I mean, there's a long list of things that are wrong. I can understand why Secretary Noem was fired. She should have been fired a while ago, but there's some work that is in store for the next secretary.
Well, how's this process going to unfold? I presume when the president writes that he will be secretary, he means acting secretary by March 31st. The White House is talking about fast-tracking this confirmation process. Are you prepared to do that?
Well, obviously the chair of the committee, Rand Paul, will be scheduling the hearing and try to bring him up as quickly as possible. But, we'll be ready to ask those questions. I've got a lot of serious concerns about what's happened at Homeland Security, particularly now with the war in Iran. We have been pushing the fact that our principal cybersecurity agency, CISA, which oversees cybersecurity, at a time we're at war with Iran, and Iran is a cyber threat. They've laid off 1/3 of the cyber professionals there that we know of, and they've transferred many more to immigration and deportation as opposed to cybersecurity with what they're trained for. And that is unacceptable. We also know that there have been significant cuts in the anti-terrorism units at Homeland Security. How we could be doing all of this while we go to war with Iran makes no sense. So whoever the incoming secretary is, we're going to have some tough questions for him, and they better have answers, because this is really putting America at risk.
Well, of course, it's all closed right now, Senator. When we talk about DHS, I'm curious if there are conversations underway right now about a change at the top helping to unlock a deal on funding. You're introducing a number of new ideas that involve potential reform underneath the umbrella of DHS. But if, in fact, there is a new head of the agency that's confirmed with the help of Democrats, that would suggest some malleability on some of the issues you're talking about. Would that bring about a reopening of the Department of Homeland Security?
Yeah, I don't think there's any malleability there. I think whoever becomes DHS secretary is basically going to answer to Steve Miller in the White House. Secretary Noem basically was just taking their direction. I don't think there's any independence there. We've got to be very clear-eyed about that. And in terms of trying to open up DHS, I mean, we put a bill on the floor today to basically open it up for CISA, for the Coast Guard, for FEMA. The Republicans rejected that. They said, no, we don't want to open it up, but we want to make sure that we also open up the ICE. But you got to remember, ICE folks and federal agents are already fully funded under the bill that passed in July.
Yes.
And what we're asking for is pretty simple. It just says federal agents should abide by the same rules and guidelines that our local police follow every day in our streets. That's not much to ask for. In fact, the American people, when I tell them we just want them to follow the same rule as your local police, they're like, isn't that already the case? So we're like, no. And Republicans are not willing to do that. And they even turned down our bill today to make sure everybody else gets paid. It is really really hard to explain, particularly given the war in Iran right now.
Well, I want to ask you about that war by way of your seat on the Armed Services Committee. But lastly, with your Homeland hat still on, because these stories intersect here, Senator, have you heard on the Homeland Security Committee any credible threat of domestic terror as a result of these strikes?
Well, I don't want to get into any of those kinds of details, but certainly we have to be aware of that and concerned. And, I think although our primary concern right now with Iran is cybersecurity, they have a pretty sophisticated cyber unit. And that's why it is just simply unacceptable that 1/3 of all the cyber professionals have been let go, and many more have been reassigned to deportation roles, which is not their area of expertise. Cybersecurity is something I worry a lot about. And we need to change that as soon as possible.
Well, the president gave us a bit of an update on the latest from Iran and the way this war is being executed from the White House. Listen to what he said, Senator.
Their Navy is gone. 24 ships in 3 days. That's a lot of ships. Their anti-aircraft weapons are gone. So they have no air force. They have no air defense. All of their airplanes are gone. Their communications are gone. Missiles are gone. Launches are gone, about 60% and 64% respectively.
Assuming all of that is accurate, Senator, the U.S. military is making pretty fast work, and I don't want to downplay the challenges that remain. I'm just curious about the rhetoric we're hearing from Pete Hegseth and from Marco Rubio, suggesting that a major intensification is coming, that a much stronger wave of attacks is ahead in the coming days. Is that what we need right now, and exactly what would that include?
I don't know. I mean, that's part of the problem. We don't have an idea of what the actual plans are, how those are going to go forward. What does victory look like? What is an exit plan? These are normally things that are fully discussed before the United States goes to war. Of course, normally there's Congress is involved with a declaration of war or authorization of military force. That hasn't occurred. The American people don't support this, and they've been less than transparent. And it seems to change constantly. And you have to understand that Iran does have a lot of tools at their disposal. One of those are drones. Very effective with drones, which we've seen drone attacks throughout the Gulf region. We know they've provided massive number of drones to the Russians in the war in Ukraine. Those drones continue to provide a lethal threat, particularly to ships in the Straits of Hormuz. And that's why we're seeing gas prices up dramatically now. The other thing to think about is that close to 30% of fertilizer comes out of through the Straits of Hormuz as we're going into planting season right now. That means spikes in fertilizer cost in addition to gasoline cost. And this is on top of the chaotic tariffs that have raised the cost of the average American family by close to $2,000 a year. So Americans are paying very heavily for this, not to mention the amount of money that's being spent on this operation while cutting health care and food assistance and other critical government programs.
There have been so many questions about regime change, Senator. The president today, in an interview with Axios, suggested that he must play a role in choosing the next leader of Iran. How exactly would that work?
I have no idea. I have no idea how that's going to work. We know in Venezuela, basically the person who's in charge is basically the right-hand person of Maduro. She's a narco-terrorist like he was, and so there really was no change there. We just have more of the same. If that's the criteria for his pick, I think we should all be concerned.
It's good to have you back with us, Senator. Democrat Gary Peters of Michigan, the top Democrat on the Senate Homeland Security Committee. Thank you. U.S. officials are writing draft regulations that would restrict AI chip shipments to anywhere in the world without American approval. The proposed regulation moving stocks of NVIDIA, AMD, and the like throughout the trading day. For details, we turn now to Power Moves with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, who joins us live from World Headquarters in New York. Another day where Washington is moving Wall Street, Romaine.
Yeah, it was an immediate impact, too. And if you remember, Joe, it was on Monday where Bloomberg reported that the Trump administration was considering capping some of those high-end AI accelerator chips in terms of the number that it could sell. But what we learned today is that this plan apparently is much, much broader than what we had originally reported here. The idea is that basically this would restrict AI shipments, these AI accelerator shipments, anywhere around the world here. Now, it's not quite clear if there would even be a specific cap. I think the issue here for some of these companies is that it seems that on a case-by-case basis, they would basically have to go through the administration or some sort of entity spun out from this administration to even get approvals for those sales, which for some of these companies would effectively be a non-starter. NVIDIA did fall at one point during the session, down about 3%. Now, it did recoup those losses and managed to finish in the green, but for the the rest of the tech of the chip stocks, that was not the case. Most of those names, like Lam Research, Applied Materials, KLA, Marvell, and AMD, all finishing lower on the day. In fact, the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index now pacing a loss on the week close to about 4%. We'll see what happens tomorrow. But this is really the big bugaboo here, is that these companies, they're producing a lot. They're selling a lot here in the U.S. They're selling a lot, of course, in Europe as well. But the holy grail for a lot of these companies is whether the market for China will open up. And at least for right now, it seems that that path is looking a lot less likely.
Romaine, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, live from New York. Coming up, how the U.S. military is using AI for operations in Iran and when we will need to restock munitions. We'll talk it out with Ben Jensen, director of the Futures Lab at CSIS, next on Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington as we continue our coverage of operations in Iran. We hear from the Secretary of Defense now. Pete Hegseth is speaking live at CENTCOM headquarters at MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, Florida. This is live on Bloomberg.
Power in CENTCOM, EUCOM is able to support that as well. So we know we're laser focused on our hemisphere and our homeland. That's why we locked down the border. That's why we're working with partners to take on cartels. That's why we're sinking drug boats. That's why we're on the offense there. But the beautiful things about combatant commands is that, you know, Brad Cooper's laser focused on Central Command, just like Frank Donovan is laser focused on Southern Command. We can do both. That's what a global power can do. Ultimately, this issue of Iran's nuclear pursuit and their unwillingness through negotiations to stop it was something President Trump has said for a long time needs to be dealt with. And after 47 years, he's doing something that no other president was willing to do. And we're doing it overwhelmingly, and we're doing it decisively, while also in other parts of the globe having the desired effect. I mean, take, for example, what we displayed yesterday, the Iranian ship in the Indian Ocean, sunk by Indo-PACOM, another combatant command, who coordinated with us in order to make that happen. So America's reach is global. Our focus here, though, these missions are narrow, they're scoped, and Admiral Cooper is well on his way to ensuring that we reach those objectives. Right here, yes, sir.
Full condolences for the troops killed. Do the Ukrainians are talking about providing low-cost interceptors, given their experience? Is that something that the Pentagon is looking for? And Admiral Cooper, can you walk us through a little bit about how effective the Lucas drones have been, what kind of targets they've hit, and how much that's helped, given that they're low-cost alternatives to the more expensive units?
Sure. I'm not familiar with the particular offer, but interceptors in general. We've had a number of new capabilities being fielded. Obviously, I'm not going to talk about it from an operational perspective of what those are. But I think you have seen over a period of time us kind of get on the other side of this cost curve on drones in general. If I just walk back a couple of years, you remember what you used to always hear, we're shooting down a $50,000 drone with a $2 million missile. These days, we're spending a lot of time shooting down $100,000 drones with $10,000 weapons from ours. So that's one aspect of it. Lucas, indispensable. As many of you know, and if you don't know, this was an original Iranian drone design. We captured it, pulled the guts out, sent it back to America, put a little Made America on it, brought it back here, and we're shooting it at the Iranians. Good targets.
Good targets. Absolutely. Right there. Yes.
Thank you so much, Secretary. President Trump, in his first speech after the launch of the Operation Epic Fury, he addressed Iranian people, and he said that there is going to be a time for you to come out, but it's not now. Stay home. It's not safe. I want to know if there is a timeline for that you're going to urge Iranian people to come out, how that is going to play out, and how are you going to protect the protesters? You know that they're going to be shot probably, as we witnessed in January. That's what happened. How are you going to protect and support the protesters? And Admiral, I have one question for you. How are you going to minimize the civilian harms? We have a lot of evidence that the Basij units IRGC commanders, they are now gathering in schools, in hospitals, in purely residential areas because their headquarters are bombarded, they are ruined, of course. So how are you going to protect the civilians while you're attacking the IRGC people hard? Thank you.
I would just say on the protests, obviously the Iranian people showed a lot of courage in those protests, and we saw the Iranian regime was revealed for what it is in the way they reacted to that. The world saw that. No one's done more than President Trump to reopen the opportunity for those who want a free Iran to do so. Ultimately, it's common sense, as he said up front. Don't go out and protest while bombs are dropping inside Tehran and elsewhere. So there will come a moment where he determines, or they determine, that it's the time to seize that advantage. But there's a lot of things we're doing and the Israeli military is doing, targeting those individuals who are targeting those who protest. The more you do that and you erode their will and you erode their capabilities, the more you create an opportunity for people to boldly stand up.
Yeah, I would just reinforce the point. We're targeting the people. We're targeting the headquarters and the people who are targeting the protesters. First and foremost, I'd also just double down on the president's comments that he previously made to the people: stay in your homes, keep things calm, stay out of the way. There's a lot of U.S. and Israeli capacity coming over. We're hitting a lot of targets. The best thing for them to do for right now is just to lay low.
Right here.
One common outcome of American military action in the past has been taking in thousands of refugees into the American homeland, and I'm wondering if there's any safeguards put in place to make sure that the American people aren't having to have another wave of refugees from the Middle East or anywhere else come and stay here.
I think it's safe to say there's no plan for a wave of new Middle Eastern refugees to the United States of America. I think, as the president has pointed out for a long time, there are a lot of countries in the region who would be capable of providing that kind of support if need be, but that's certainly not something we're planning on. Yep, back there. Yep.
Yes, sir. Michael in Washington Times. I wanted to ask, I know, Semper Gumby is always a truism in the military. Did the British decision to refuse Diego Garcia have any impact on the mission itself? Did you have to adjust, or were you able to just completely, go with the mission without even worrying about that?
Well, as the president stated, it was unfortunate that that the Brits didn't, from day one, say, "Hey, go ahead and have access." But we got there. We got there, and that's now part of the way that we're operationalizing bomber runs. And it's part of when we say more to come. It's more fighter squadrons, it's more capabilities, it's more defensive capabilities, and it's more bomber pulses more frequently. The amount of firepower over Iran and over Tehran is about to surge dramatically. And part of it is that we're going to have even more basing. And it's not just the UK. We've had other friends step up, and we're grateful for that. Maybe one more right here.
Yeah. The Azeri president earlier today basically authorized his Minister of Defense to begin preparing troops for some type of retaliatory action after the airport strike. Has the Department of War and CENTCOM been working on deconflicting with the Azeri if they were to move in or attempt something in retaliation?
I'm sure there are plans, and I'll let the Admiral speak to that. But that does allow me to kind of address this idea that the war might be expanding, or there's chaos, and nothing could be further from the truth. If anything, what Iran is doing by targeting allied countries that would otherwise want to stay out of this, they've actually pulled them into the American orbit. So now you've got UAE and Qatar and Bahrain and Saudi and Kuwait and others saying, "Hey, we're with you. We'll shoot with you. We'll fly with you. We'll defend with you. We'll allow you more basing and other opportunities," a lot of which we can't talk about and won't talk about. But it's actually firming up the unity of the resistance in order to focus exactly where we need to. So this idea that it's expanding or going, no, it's actually simplifying in a number of ways exactly what we need to achieve and how we'll achieve it. I don't know if you anything to add to that.
I won't get ahead of policy in terms of what we might do. What I will point out is this is now the 12th country that Iran has attacked. 12 countries, and it goes right back to the Secretary's point. Those 12 countries are none too happy, and I look forward to working with all the partners who are willing to join us in this.
And I would just close by saying,
Mr. Secretary, one more question. What is your message to Americans who are concerned about security here at home with the change-up that we're going to see at the Department of Homeland Security?
Well, I think Kristi Noem did an excellent job over there securing our border and keeping us focused on threats, and President making a change. We all serve at the pleasure of the President. I'm sure Markwayne Mullin will do a fantastic job. He's been a friend of mine for a long time. But Kristi did a great job setting us up for success. So I don't have any concerns about whether or not the Homeland will be covered down on. And I'll just end by saying I wish every American could get a chance to see what we see. I had a chance to go into the control room, into the Tactical Operations Center, go see these young men and women that are doing this, the dedication that they show at every level, the way they've refined their craft. Now, I'm talking to a young colonel who's iterating on how we target and how we find and fix different aspects of what the Iranians are trying to do. If they don't know what they're up against. And if they think they've got it solved for, they're wrong. And ultimately, the combination of our ingenuity, the skill, the professionalism, the discipline, and then the sheer weight of the capabilities of the U.S. military, what you're going to see may look routine. It may start to be like, oh, another boat. Oh, another launcher. Oh, another drone facility. What it takes to do this with the precision that we do is world-class. No one else can do it. And it's world-class Americans. Like the ones I saw here, like the ones that are coming home that we're going to greet home, that are the engine of what makes our country great. And so I'm so grateful for folks like those here at CENTCOM, at Central Command, who are under your command. Thank you for your decisive leadership. And all I'll say to you is what I say to them, keep going. Because the President and myself, we have your back. Thank you, Admiral. Appreciate it.
Thanks very much.
Mr. Secretary, how's
All right, that's Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth making his way from the podium at CENTCOM headquarters in Tampa, Florida, taking questions there with Admiral Brad Cooper, commander, of course, U.S. Central Command. With us now with some insights into what we just heard and also the latest in operations in Iran is Ben Jensen, director of the Futures Lab, senior fellow with the Defense and Security Department at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. Ben, it's great to see you and welcome back. I've been very curious to hear your thoughts as we witness some new technology being deployed here. You're famous for your strike force component in which you actually track munitions that are being used. So maybe you can bring some specifics to the questions that we've been asking here. For starters, the president says the airspace is essentially closed in Iran. Could we have done that without the use of AI accelerating the deployment of these munitions?
I think we could, but I think what I want to focus you in on is the sheer military success of the initial campaign. You're talking over 4,000 strikes between the U.S. and Israel in less than 4 days. You're talking about not only hitting and destroying what remained of Iranians' air defense, sinking over 17 ships, destroying their ability to launch anti-ship cruise missiles, hitting what are called TELs, they're launchers for missiles, so it's a brilliant approach. I can't destroy every missile, but if I destroy the launcher, it's harder for you to fire the missile. And so that's called deliberate targeting. That means that men and women that Secretary Hegseth was talking about, Admiral Cooper was talking about, have spent years building targeting packets. Now, was technology helpful for that? Yeah. Sure. Would AI add a little bit? Yes. But what you saw in that initial was the ability to synchronize combat power, the use of cyber, the use of space, electronic warfare to achieve decisive effects in a short amount of time. Where AI can play a role in that is in helping accelerate battlefield damage assessment so you don't hit the same target twice. It can play a role in potentially helping you deconflict logistics, thinking about, do you have enough fuel at that airbase? How many additional sorties do you need to launch? When is it time to move munitions? So think about it like simple productivity gains, not Skynet or Terminator.
Okay, sure.
That's going on.
Yep, understood. We should let everyone know you were senior research director for the U.S. Cyberspace Solarium Commission, and you're still a reserve officer, I believe, in the United States Army. Cyber, to the extent that we are using it, it was highlighted by the president in Venezuela, and we know that cyber attacks are coming in from Iran. How much of a component of the battle is cyber?
So this is the most interesting change. And look, I actually left working at UBS Warburg to enlist in the U.S. Army because of 9/11. I will say since then, 2022, in the 24 years that I've served and even studied war, the most fundamental change is exactly that. There is no modern pulse operation. You heard the Secretary say bomber pulse. Yes. There is no modern complex strike operation without the use of space, without the use of cyberspace, and without the use of the electromagnetic spectrum. Both how we communicate, pass data packets, but how we deny that to the adversary. So this increasingly plays a central role, not just in Iran, but it's key to our theory of victory in the Pacific. When you hear Admiral Pappy saying, hey, counter C5ISRT, that's what he's talking about. So cyber operations, you both set the conditions, so it gives you better intelligence. What am I going to strike? When should I strike it? And then when you have these exquisite toolkits, and when you're in the adversary's system, you can achieve effects that allow you to strike. So imagine shutting down radars, which actually President Trump did his first term in retaliation for the Iranians shooting down a drone. Imagine all of a sudden geolocating key leaders so that you could strike, which was either us or the Israelis. Someone did a version of the Red Wedding in the Middle East, a very sophisticated strike operation in time and space. So there is no modern joint warfare without cyberspace. That's actually been a change in the last really 24 years.
Really interesting. You speak a language not a lot of people understand, so go slow with us here.
All right.
On to ballistic missiles. There have been questions about the United States stockpile. We know that there are these underground missile fields essentially in Iran. That hasn't proven to be a very smart strategy, because as soon as they start bringing launchers out from underground, as the president said, we knock them down. Both sides are warning of a more intense phase of the war coming. What does that mean about our stockpile of missiles and what we might be about to use?
Sure. So actually, this is an interesting question, because usually our fear is around what we call interceptors. So Patriots, say PAC-2, PAC-3, and different versions have different levels of sophistication. And they're a globally used missile. So it's not just the U.S. military has them, Taiwan has them, Japan has them. We gave a lot to the Ukrainians. Gulf states have spent a lot of money on these. So your first concern is, how many Patriot missiles am I shooting to intercept? The good news story in this is that actually ballistic missile launches in Iran are dropping dramatically for exactly the reason the president said. So once you take out their air defenses, you don't need stealth fighters like the F-35. You can have high-altitude, slow-flying MQ-9s doing what's called a strike box. I can have that sit, because there's no person in the cockpit. I can have it sit for hours over a target of a potential launch site and wait for the Iranians to move in position. That's a target I can shoot with a Hellfire. We have no problem with our Hellfire stockpiles. So if you go on the offense the right way, you reduce the strain on your munition stockpile for defense. Ultimately, munition stockpiles are a closely held secret for good reason. And in theory, like you heard Admiral Cooper say, maybe we're rolling out some new technologies, whether that's directed energy or some other capabilities to intercept drones or ballistic missiles. We'll probably find out after the dust has settled. So we should be concerned about the munitions, but that means for your viewers, you know, Lockheed and Raytheon both took a little bit of a dip today, probably profit taking, because both have had like they beat quarterly estimates for, you know, Q20. So probably a buying opportunity. And frankly, the White House, with especially Secretary Feinberg, Deputy Secretary of Defense, have been very aggressive at trying to negotiate new deals with these firms, expand production lines.
Yes, we need to buy a lot of stuff, or will at some point. Just lastly, this has been fascinating and really helpful for us. Why are we then flying B-52s?
Because it's a great plane.
Okay,
right?
But are we going to be carpet bombing? What do they carry that we might drop?
So the beauty of when we see a B-52, we all think it's the same plane, but it's not. It's been fundamentally rewired with new avionics, new engines. And the beauty of the B-52 is that it can carry a lot of munitions. And if I control the airspace, that actually allows me to, just like I would with the drone, park this exquisite instrument high in the air, and then wait for strike missions. So likely it's loaded with a mix of JDAMs, so I can hit precision targets. And again, everything we can do to turn whatever this campaign in Iran is into using cheaper munitions like a JDAM, like a Hellfire, and save the exquisite stuff to deter a larger war against China is actually a net positive from a military standpoint. I'll leave the politics out of it, but it's a net positive from a military standpoint. So the more you see B-52s, that's less wear and tear on your B-2, your B-21, your stealth force. So that's actually a good news story, even though it seems like, what's that old plane still doing around?
Yeah, it's fascinating. We always learn something when we spend time with Ben Jensen. Ben, thank you so much. He's director of the Futures Lab at CSIS, and we thank you for your service.
Thank you.
This week's Big Take looks at the potential inflationary impact of sustained high oil prices as a result of the Middle East conflict. Joining us now with her insights, one of the contributors to this piece Jennifer Welch, Chief Geoeconomics Analyst at Bloomberg Economics. Jenny, it's great to have you. WTI, West Texas Intermediate crude, touching $80 a barrel for the first time today, and a lot of analysts see it going higher. What is the broader impact?
So I think what we're seeing today is the oil market starting to reconcile with the idea that some of these disruptions, the effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz, taking offline major energy facilities throughout the region might not be that temporary. Even still, we see room for prices to go further up. You know, for example, if these disruptions prove to last beyond the next few days and into the next few weeks, as fighting continues at this high level of intensity, we could see them go over $100. We estimate even to $108 a barrel.
$108 a barrel, which brings us back to Ukraine levels, the outset of the Ukraine war. Did the president's promise or offer to provide insurance or even military escorts to oil tankers going through the strait cause this delayed reaction? There was a feeling yesterday that this might not be as bad as some feared.
So I think that offers some hope. And there is some history to suggest that this is a case that could work, right? I think the challenge is going to be reassuring companies that this is going to work and finding a way to cover the cost of that insurance in particular, which can be prohibitively expensive right now. The other thing to keep in mind is no one really knows the state of Iranian stockpiles right now, especially in the wake of U.S. and Israeli attacks. But they don't need that much to continue this threat of the odd drone attack taking out a tanker, right? And we've seen this in the Red Sea, that can have a real deterrent effect on shipping. So I think that's going to be the key question to watch is how does the U.S. operationalize that pledge and whether or not companies actually buy into it. I think another option is that we might see some supply rerouting for energy producers that they have the ability to divert elsewhere.
By sea or pipeline?
Pipelines. For some of the energy producers, not all of them have that option. Some also have ports that aren't on the Strait of Hormuz and might be able to get the oil out elsewhere. And then another variable here might be China, right, which is heavily dependent on Middle Eastern oil, and especially coming out of the Strait of Hormuz, does not want to see that shut off.
Wow. Jenny, your team has been doing incredible coverage and instrumental to our work here. We thank you for it. Jennifer Welch of Bloomberg Economics with us live on Bloomberg TV and radio. You can find that story, The Big Take, wherever you subscribe to podcasts. Joining us now for more is retired Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, former IDF spokesperson, now senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. It's great to have you with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. The role that Israel is playing here is, of course, also instrumental to what the U.S. is doing. I spoke earlier today with Israel's ambassador to the U.S., who spoke about the partnership, and we've heard Pete Hegseth refer to this as well. Many have been asking, though, who's calling the shots here? Does it depend on the operation?
Yeah, well, hello, shalom from Israel. Thanks for having me on. I believe it's my first time actually on Bloomberg, so that's exciting for me.
Well, thanks for making your debut.
Yeah, listen, I have absolutely no doubt who is calling the shots. That is the President of the United States of America. And the entire operation, it is U.S.-led, U.S.-sanctioned. It started with U.S. actions, and it will end when the U.S. President says it ends. That's how clear it is for me. And, you know, we can look into the future. I think somewhere along the line, there may be differences between American objectives and Israeli objectives. Currently, I see a lot of overlap, and I see that there's tremendous agreement. But somewhere along the line, the U.S. probably will say, okay, that's enough. This is good enough in terms of the degradation of the military threat that the Islamic Republic of Iran poses to the U.S. and U.S. assets. While Israel will feel, well, actually, this isn't enough for us because we have our civilians so close by, so we want to do more and we want to see the regime really undone. And then will be a very good time to revisit who is in the driving seat, and my money will be on the U.S. president calling the shots and really ending that question for everybody in a final way.
Well, that's truly interesting. Could we be in a world then where the United States is concluding operations, presumably from the air and sea, and Israel considers boots on the ground in Iran?
No, I don't know. If that was what is understood from what I said, then no, definitely no. What I'm saying is that I think that the U.S. and Israel are working together today in, I think we're rewriting the book and adding new chapters in how to conduct joint warfare, how to collect intel, how to suppress ballistic missile fire, how to conduct cyber and electronic warfare in support of those actions, how to collect intel in a combat environment, and also air defense. Really magnificent achievements that are, I would say, world-class. I don't think that there are any other countries who could be doing it. And I'm very happy to be part of this coalition fighting, or that we are fighting alongside the Americans for this very, what I see is a very important and noble goal to pursue, the undoing of the Iranian regime and the freeing of the Iranian people. I do say, and I am cognizant of the fact that the national and security interests of the US and those of Israel are, however, slightly different. And somewhere along the way, I think that there will be differences. And I think that eventually what will determine what happens is the US preference and US interest. And Israel will have to make do with what is achieved up until that stage. But that's a few weeks in the future. I wouldn't want to get ahead of where we are today.
Well, I hate to do just that, Colonel, but the president told Axios in an interview today that he needs to play a role in choosing the next leader of Iran. Does Israel as well?
I don't think, I think Israel is today in a much more mature position where Israel is aware of the limitations of its own power. Iran is a country that is far bigger than Israel. It's almost 10 times the size of the population. It's 60 times the size in terms of landmass. And I think that Israel understands that it has no business and no real ability to have any such real influence in a country the size of Iran. And I think we've learned from past mistakes not to do things or not to deal with things that we don't really have the capacity to sincerely influence. The situation in Iran will be determined by the Iranian people. The Iranian people are the ones who eventually, once enough weight is applied on the oppressive regime, they'll be able to free themselves if they have the intention and desire to do so, and I believe that they have, and so do many others. And then they will chart the path forward, whatever Israel or the US want to do. But I think they are the ones who will be the owners of their destiny once they're given that initial help. I think that's the positive outcome that we're looking for. I don't think that picking leaders from afar is going to work. I don't think that that's what the Iranian people want.
Retired Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. We thank you for joining us today on Bloomberg. Coming up, how lawmakers are responding to President Trump's replacement of Kristi Noem at the top at DHS. We'll discuss with our political panel. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Thanks for joining us. President Trump's ousting of Kristi Noem as the head of DHS is paving the way for Republican Senator Markwayne Mullin of Oklahoma to take over the role. Yeah, this all developed today. Senator Mullin is set to face a tough Senate confirmation process, you could argue, but this would not be his first time taking part in a contentious hearing on Capitol Hill. It's pretty hard to forget Senator Mullin's challenging the head of the Teamsters Union, Sean O'Brien, to a fistfight during a hearing back in 2023.
Sir, this is a time, this is a place. If you want to run your mouth, we can be two consenting adults. We can finish it here.
Okay, that's fine. Perfect.
You want to do it now?
I'd love to do it right now.
Well, stand your butt up then.
You stand your butt up.
Oh, hold on. No, stop it.
Is that your solution? Every poll.
No, sit down.
No, you're a clown.
Sit down. Okay. You're a United States Senator.
You're an embarrassment. You're an embarrassment.
They went silence after
an embarrassment to the state of
This hearing is about the condition of the working class in America.
That's why we're talking.
You're the biggest thug here.
You brought him in.
All right,
you're the biggest thug. Even your colleagues call you.
Why you do what you're doing?
He took his ring off. The senator took his ring off, not the guy from Dorchester. Joining us now with their reaction. And by the way, we should note that they are friends now, just like our two panelists. John Seaton is with us, Republican strategist, founder, CEO, Echo Canyon Consulting, Democratic strategist Caitlin Legacki, senior fellow at Third Way. They really are friends. Well, at least they've worked together. It's great to have you both with us here as we reach across the aisle. John Seaton, what's he in for in a confirmation hearing? Or are we playing this wrong? Senators like to take care of their own.
Yeah, I do expect there may be a few fireworks. There'll certainly be some tough questions from the Democratic side of the aisle. I think at the end of the day, there's a Republican majority. Democratic Senator Fetterman has already said that he'll be voting to confirm, so I do expect him to be confirmed fairly easily.
Yeah, your next senator is a fighter, or your next secretary, I guess. Caitlin, what do you think?
Well, that's just a love language for the Teamsters. So,
Is winning him over.
Yeah. No, I mean...
Send the emails to Caitlin.
Look, I think that there's going to be a lot of opposition from Democrats, especially when it comes to, approving the nomination, reopening DHS and the funding fight. And I don't think that that is by any chance, insurmountable by Mullin, but I do think that he should come to these hearings ready to make some concessions to Democrats about how DHS and ICE are going to conduct business if he's in charge, and then how he expects to actually engage with Congress in a way that Kristi Noem never did.
This all, of course, comes after some pretty difficult days of testimony for Kristi Noem. She did the Senate side, did the House side this week. It was not only Democrats who were giving her a hard time. In fact, it was the Republicans who really made news. John Kennedy, the Republican from Louisiana, and Tom Tillis, the retiring senator, Republican from North Carolina. Here's a taste.
You decided to kill that dog because you had not invested the appropriate time and training, and then you have the audacity to go into a book and say it's a leadership lesson about tough choices. My point is, those are bad decisions made in the heat of the moment, not unlike what happened up in Minneapolis.
Referring, of course, to the deadly shootings in Minneapolis. John Kennedy didn't even go there. He was talking about the ad campaign worth a couple $100 million she was conducting, and suggested at that time that it had been approved by the president himself. Was that the breaking point?
I think it was kind of death by 1,000 paper cuts. Yeah? I think that she had really, she was on thin ice already. I think that was possibly the final straw. But from what we were hearing, she was not long for that job. But yeah, the president certainly watches these hearings. He certainly has a finger on the pulse of what folks from his administration are saying. And when he heard that he had approved a $220 million expenditure that clearly he hadn't, I think that was probably the final straw.
Well, audience of one will remind everybody that Jay Powell is facing a criminal investigation for allegedly lying to a committee like that. Does that mean that Kristi Noem will face a criminal investigation?
I think it's up to congressional Republicans right now, but I do think that if and when Democrats take over the House after the midterms, they're going to have a laundry list of oversight questions for Kristi Noem related to both the ad spending and the self-dealing among her senior advisors, the acquisition of a 737 for her personal travel, purportedly, but then also the way that she has conducted business in Minneapolis and elsewhere. There's a lot of questions that Democrats have, and her simply no longer being the secretary does not absolve her of responding to subpoenas. So I actually think that there is room and there's likely an appetite for Democrats to keep her front and center going forward.
Yeah, well, I asked Senator Gary Peters this, the top Democrat on Homeland Security, and he was a decided no. Does this hasten a deal on DHS funding? You get new leadership. Does it bring Democrats closer to a yes on funding?
I think it depends on what Mullin and Trump are willing to say to Democrats behind closed doors. I don't think Democrats want to keep DHS permanently shut down, but they're not going to vote to reopen it without some serious concessions and reforms. And I think Mullin has to come to the table with a real willingness to play ball.
Interesting. I'm sure John Thune is having those conversations right now, John Seaton. The matter of gas prices came up earlier this hour. We're looking at a national average now above $3 a gallon. It's going to keep rising. We saw crude today hit $80. Some forecasts point to 100 or higher. Jenny Welch and our Bloomberg economics team, I think, have it pegged at 108. If you're on the midterm campaign trail, this is a problem.
Yeah, it's probably not the news you're hoping
How do you
for
manage
to end the week.
Yeah.
I mean, look, I mean, we are at war, and I think that this was probably priced into the decision. At the end of the day, the president made the decision. That
he said today he's not worried about it. It'll come down when the war ends.
I do think that prices will come down. But no, if you're a Republican right now at this moment, you're probably happy that the election isn't this coming Tuesday. You're probably happy that there's still several months to hopefully see these prices come down. The 2024 election was decided largely on affordability issues.
Yes,
and I know the Republicans are talking about it quite a bit. They're hearing about it at town halls. They're hearing about it from their constituents. And so, like I said, I'm glad that the election is on Tuesday. I think there's time to see these prices come down.
Well, Joe Biden knows a little bit about this. When gas prices started skyrocketing, it was, in fact, Vladimir Putin's invasion that got that started. And we were all reminded that this is a global market the president cannot always influence.
That's right. No, I think, you know, part of the frustration that Trump is going to hear from voters is that you've cut health care, you've cut food assistance, you've done nothing, you've imposed all these tariffs that are jacking up prices on everyday goods. And in part because the president has never taken the step of actually explaining why this war was necessary, why he believes it was necessary. People think this is a war of choice, and I think that, frankly, we haven't seen any explanation that it wasn't yet a war of choice. And until then, they're going to hold him to a much higher standard for why he's jacking up their costs.
John Seaton, you're a strategist. If you were advising the president, would it include an Oval Office address, a way to speak to Americans to the extent that Caitlin is suggesting?
You know, I think that would be helpful, and quite frankly, I think it would be welcomed because so far the mission has been a resounding success. The Iranian nuclear capability is greatly depleted. Their navy is almost non-existent now. Anytime someone pops up as possibly the next leader of Iran, they're quickly removed from the chessboard. So I do think that the American people would like what they hear in terms of the success that we've already had in this operation, and we'll see if he takes that up.
Just tell the story. John, thank you. John Seaton, Caitlin Legacki, thank you so much for a great conversation. And check out the Washington Edition newsletter for the latest on Iran and DHS. You can find it on the terminal and online. And we thank you for joining us on another busy day in Washington. I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.